Hello, folks in the Actual Tech Media audience. Thank you for joining us today. We've got some interesting conversation teed up around privacy issues and security. And if you're working in the IT industry at all, that's going to affect you. It also affects all of us personally. So I think it's going to be a fun conversation for Scott and I. So let's just get right into it. Scott, Apple is making waves this week with some announcements around features, I suppose they're calling it, features in iOS 15 that cause some privacy concerns for folks. So to get us started, can you kind of just lay out what they're doing, what the goal for them is, how they're trying to help, and then we can get into what concerns that kind of creates.
Yeah, from what I'm seeing, it's iOS 15, iPadOS 15, watchOS 8, and possibly macOS Monterey. Basically, what Apple is adding to these operating systems is client-side, device-side scanning of photos. Now, the intent for this is to prevent explicit imagery of exploited children from making its way to iCloud photos in the web, and to reduce the preponderance of this kind of material being out in the world. Obviously, from a goals standpoint, I think that everyone agrees that getting people who exploit children off the streets is really important. No one disputes that. And it's important that those people are less enabled in terms of creating or storing that kind of imagery than they are in a lot of cases today. But there's always a but. And Derek, do we have the image that we talked about before? We have a challenge that we have to address. And one of these things is that today, what we see from Apple is that they will be scanning the device against a database of known images from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And the way this works is the NCMEC will basically provide a set of hashes against all the photos they have in their database that will reside on iPhones, iPads, watches, or whatever, right? And as new photos are added to your device, as you create new photos or as you add photos to the device, they will be hashed to see if there's a hash match or a close hash match. They're going to do some fuzzy hashing so that if you change the resolution or whatever, there will still be a match on the device against the hash so that it can be ultimately reported to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Now, you're not storing this imagery on your phone to do a match. You're storing hashes of images, so it's not like you're going to be walking around with a device that has millions of images that you really don't ever want to have to look at. And what happens then is, as your device scans images, once a certain threshold is met against those images, Apple will unlock all of your images. Someone from Apple will review your images and make a determination about whether or not that needs to be forwarded to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children for further analysis. So right now, Apple's not working directly with law enforcement. They're working with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, who will take appropriate steps. There's a couple of important caveats. Number one is this only works.
Let me stop you for a minute. A couple clarifications before we move on. So first of all, you said when a threshold is met, on those hashes. So basically, what you're saying is when a hash is close enough to another hash.
That's one. I believe there's probably a certain number of hashes too. Like if it's one image, I don't know if you'd get reported, but if it's 5,000, I don't know what exactly what threshold means in that context yet. It may be in the docs. I haven't seen it yet though.
Yeah, I just realized we haven't looked into that. I don't know what the threshold means exactly. Like you said, is it one image perfectly matches an image that's in the database, or is it a threshold of how many images hash the same as hashes in the database? Or yeah, that'd be interesting to look at. Couple of kind of caveats about where and how this applies. As we understand it, currently it is in the US only, and it's only for when you have iCloud enabled. So if for whatever reason you were really trying to opt out of this, you could basically just not enable iCloud is what we're hearing.
Yeah. So there's a couple
one of those
things.
The issue is not that I have something to hide and I don't want it. It's what we're going to get into, which is sort of the precedent that this creates and what sort of things it opens us up to in the future. So let's talk about that a little bit. I mean, what is our concern, your concern, many other people on the internet's concern about the precedent this sets?
Well, there's a couple. Number one is that if statement. Basically, if you have iCloud photo sharing enabled, then this client-side scanning engine is also enabled. And now Apple is required to make sure that they keep this kind of material off their servers, off iCloud. So it makes sense. This scanning is already taking place at iCloud. The scanning has already taken place on cloud providers across the spectrum, which makes sense. They can't have this material on their servers. No one wants this material on their servers. Let's get, that's very, very clear. The challenge is that if statement. So today we say, if you have iCloud photos enabled, then we're not going to, and then we're going to scan. You could say, okay, I'll just turn off iCloud photos. But tomorrow, that's an easy thing to change. Say, okay, flip the switch. All of a sudden, you're going to scan, regardless of whether or not they are actually being synced to iCloud or not. Now, again, we're starting with an image database that is abhorrent. So no one, very few people, because there's probably some that are like, oh crap, what am I going to do now? There's no good person disputes that this is a good goal to get these people off the streets. However, the other piece of this is an if, which is as long as we keep it against this database, the CSAM database from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. That's the other if. And the third if is something that Apple addressed in an FAQ they released on this topic, which is what happens when an oppressive regime comes to Apple and says, okay, you have this database right now, add this database too, which is a database of prohibited imagery in that country. If we can think of lots of examples of this, I'm not going to name countries, but there's lots of examples of this kind of imagery that we know triggers certain governments to take action against their citizens. Apple's response to that has been, Apple will refuse such demands. Okay, great. The problem is they've built it. So they've got on their phones a surveillance network that they've built with, I don't know how many iPhones are in the world. There's a lot. And so essentially, we have a problem here, one that right now we have inside Apple people who are, well, seemingly pro-privacy, and that can change. Or when Apple gets a request from an oppressive regime to say either you will add our database or you will exit our country, what are they going to do? Are they really going to leave? No, they're not. They're going to say, okay, and do it. I mean, I don't, yeah. I guess so that's where I don't see the problem today being that this is going to get abused. I see the problem tomorrow that that's going to get abused. They've built something that works. And
yeah, I don't know if you can put your finger on what your biggest concern here is, but that would be mine, is the cat's out of the bag. And yeah, that's a problem because, as you say, all of the ifs are in place now. And to Apple's credit, they have historical precedent for saying no to other entities asking them to dig into the data in ways that would violate privacy. We know they've pushed back pretty hard on FBI and whatever, NSA, whoever else. At least that's what we're told. Who knows?
Yeah, true.
So the historical precedent for them saying no is pretty good. However, they'll just say no until they don't say no. And like you said, if there's a case where the fallout to Apple of saying no causes serious enough business damage, well, they're probably just going to say yes. And that's the concern here, because if the, as you're calling it, surveillance network was never built, then you can never say yes. But now that it's built, you can say no. It's like if you're standing in the kitchen and there's a plate of cookies on the counter, you can just say no for as long as you're able to say no, but you might eventually say yes. Now, if you follow my wife's strategy and just never bring the cookies in the house, no problem. You can't eat the cookies. That's what we're dealing with here. We have brought the cookies in the house and put them on the kitchen counter. And now we're just going to stand and we'll all look at them and try and say no. And that's
it doesn't work. And I want to step back on something. Apple has said no before, partially because they didn't have the tools. So I don't remember exactly the case. It was maybe it was something around, I don't know. Anyway, the FBI or some other three-letter agency went to Apple and said, we want you to do X. And they said, we don't have a tool to do X, and we're not going to build one. They can't be compelled to build tools. Well, maybe they can, but it's hard to build tools. They didn't exist already. And the difference here is now it exists. And so can they be compelled to expand its use? Probably. I mean, right now we have goodwill and technical limits. Okay. Built-in technical safeguards with the guardrails that can easily be removed. I mean, if you think about, programming logic, if iCloud enable scanning engine, well, that if statement's trivially easy to remove. So you're scanning images, whether or not they're moving to iCloud or not. And then you're taking a device that people purchased. Now, again, do we really own anything anymore? But at the same time, people believe they own their devices. We're basically walking around with scanning engines in our pockets, watching our every move. I mean, maybe there's cats out of the bag on that kind of stuff already because how much we're being tracked on our phones. But this feels like from a company who has staked its reputation on privacy to be a serious step in the wrong direction. One of the things I've read a lot about this over the last few days is that maybe this is their prelude to enabling end-to-end iCloud encryption, which doesn't exist right now. And in order for that to work and also keep that kind of material off their servers, they would have to have a way to be able to know what that material is. But essentially, this engine becomes a man in the middle because it's on your device, right under your credentials, so it has access to your keys. And so it's a back door into everyone's device. That even if we have end-to-end encryption on iCloud. So I just see a lot of potential challenges with this. To be clear, I get what's trying to happen here right now, the immediate goal. I worry about what's going to happen tomorrow when Apple leadership changes or when there's the critical business decision that we just talked about, Apple's forced into making. What's going to happen there? What's Apple going to do? Are they going to say yes? Or are they going to continue to push back and potentially drive down their share price? Who knows?
So let's just say that is a correct inference that what's coming down the road is end-to-end encryption for the rest of iCloud. It's become clear to me over the last few years that when you see something that like this is clearly like a really tough business decision, it's never black and white. And so what you're proposing here is like, that's a really tricky situation because what you're saying is, in the name of enabling much greater privacy, which is end-to-end encryption for everybody else and the law-abiding citizens who are users of the platform, we have to do this one thing that's like a step backward in privacy potentially. I don't have a point. I guess what I'm saying is I have a lot of empathy for Apple leaders who are trying to make this decision, if that's true. And maybe it is, maybe it isn't. We don't know. But if it really is a prelude to end-to-end encryption for the rest of iCloud, I very much sympathize with the leaders who had to make that call because it's one of those things where like either way, you're going to get beat up publicly. You're going to continue to get beat up because it's not encrypted end-to-end, or you're going to get beat up because of what we're talking about right now. That's tough.
Yeah, I mean, it's when you're as big as Apple or Facebook or Microsoft or Google, obviously you end up having to do some things that are unpalatable. I mean, if we look back in history, Google's mantra used to be "Don't be evil." I mean, they used to say that, and then they had to do some things, or maybe not had, but they started doing some things that were, objectively evil in some ways. And so they dropped that tagline, and because it wasn't going to do anything good for them. In Apple's case here, somehow they claim this is increasing our privacy, which I'm not quite sure I buy. I see, again, today it doesn't necessarily change things. Tomorrow it could. They've done this alongside something that does have a good goal, and basically they're going to be scanning iMessage on device for child accounts that are under 13 that may try to send or receive objectionable material. And that, though, is a different service. And the way that's working is that parents can opt in to that service. It's an opt-in service only. So parents can say, I want to be notified if my child tries to send or receives explicit material. And again, that leaves the decision in the hands of the parents, which is where it should be. And that's for child accounts under 13. After that, I don't believe it's actually even available yet. It could come at some point, who knows? So that's a different sort of, that one I'm fine with because it's an opt-in service and it allows parents to have control or make the decision about what their child is doing on their phones. The other one is not opt-in. It's unless you decide you want to use iCloud photos, which a lot of people do because you don't want to lose your photos if your phone dies, right? I mean, there's lots of other places you can store them. I mean, whenever I plug my phone into my computer, it's my Dropbox pops up and says, do you want to sync these to me? There's other places you can back up your photos, but part of the reason Apple's so popular is the ease of use of their ecosystem. And when people have to start making privacy choices, or because they're worried about what could happen tomorrow with regard to their photos being used by a regime that may not have their best interest in mind, that starts to become a delicate thing to have to navigate.
I'm not a machine learning expert, but have you seen anything or thought about what is the possibility of false positives in the identification process? And I wonder how they would treat that.
So Apple claims that the false positive chance, maybe it wasn't Apple, but I read a statistic this weekend that basically the chance of a false positive is 1 in a trillion. Now, nobody really knows. I mean, until it's actually out there in the world, we don't know what that's going to mean. The problem is the kind of scarlet letter that even an accusation like this raises is damning for someone, whether they're guilty or innocent. At that point, once you're accused of something like this, that never goes back. So it's apparently 1 in a trillion. I don't know if it'll be worse than that or better than that. I think that's something where only time's going to be able to tell. Now, because of I think the threshold, I don't know how the threshold works either yet. I have to read the papers more depth. But the threshold is a certain number of images. Like if there's 1,000 images that all get flagged, well, okay. You're probably not going to, if it's a 1 in a trillion chance, it's probably even less than that.
Right.
But if it's just a single image, I could see that having a much higher potential positive threshold, especially if you go and do any Google searching for fuzzy hashing. It's amazing what images to a machine learning engine can look similar to a machine learning engine, but to us be like that those aren't even close. So
I just saw one yesterday that was breaded and fried chicken nuggets and these brown fluffy miniature poodles.
Yeah,
and they were very similar in the pictures, and
I've seen that one actually. And the one I saw was a person, and then this abstract art that didn't even look like a person. It didn't even have a person in it. So yeah, from when you start doing, now the problem with trying to do an exact match to meet the goals that are trying to be achieved here is that all you got to do is crop out a pixel, and that image gets a different hash. And then it never matches. But if you can start doing a close enough match for all intents and purposes, cropping out a pixel doesn't change the hash of the image, and then you can more easily get hits. The question is, do you want to easily get hits? And I guess if you want to get these people off the streets, you do. Right. But if you're really concerned about privacy, you got to be really careful.
So you mentioned a minute ago, guilty and innocent. Does this feel a little bit to you like everybody is guilty until proven innocent by the algorithm?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where I hate the phrase, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to worry about. I have nothing to hide today, but that doesn't mean that we'll end up with a government in 4 years that would look at my images that I have today and object.
Yeah, it depends on which things you might like to hide, right? I don't have anything to hide today, but I may be in a different situation, even 8, 12 years down the road, where I don't. It's not something I morally feel like I should hide, but politically in society, maybe I'm in the minority. It gets weird.
Yeah, and as of today, the scanning engine is enabled in the U.S. only. Now, in here, we have some legal protections in our Constitution that would make warrantless searches, not possible. One of the questions that was asked, though, in one of the forums I read on this was, if you're reported via this engine to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which is a private organization, and they turn over to law enforcement, is the evidence admissible? And since it wasn't from a law enforcement agency, I don't know, because it's essentially not law enforcement that's doing a warrantless search. It's this other agency and this other organization that's then turning the evidence over to law enforcement. So that's another question. I don't know the answer to that question.
Interesting.
If that would end up being something that has to be settled in court, or if there's precedent for something like that.
So for our folks who are practicing IT pros, maybe security practitioners, do you have any thoughts about what the implications here are for them more broadly? Does this set a precedent that is of concern for businesses and security professionals?
I mean, today, probably not, the way that it's deployed. I could see, again, it comes back to those ifs that we talked about earlier in this episode. It's really, if this starts to get abused, or if we end up with leadership changes at Apple that say, hey, let's open the floodgates, and corporate espionage is a real thing. The scanning engine can make it easy to find other materials about competitors, or there's all kinds of things that could happen. Again, these are all theoretical right now, but we've seen before, in this country included, how things like For the Children, look at the war on drugs, how horribly that went. We made some serious knee-jerk reactions after 9/11 in the name of terrorism, and those things that we're still faced with today. So it feels, this is where I come from on this. It's like, it may not be something we're going to feel right now, but I feel like something we have to keep an eye on to prevent happening down the line. Make sure this never gets morphed into something that can be used against people that aren't doing anything wrong. And if you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to hide. Issue is not a good excuse to not get for something like this that has such potential for abuse. So today, I don't know if there's much we can do except look at it, study it, see for yourself how you feel about it and how your organization would feel about it. If you have concerns, make sure Apple's aware of those concerns. I mean, it may not do anything, but at least the more people that raise concerns, that at some point there's going to be a threshold that's met, that they'll have to say, well, maybe we need to rethink this. I don't know if that'll ever happen, but it's something we need to keep an eye on. And I think it's important for people to know what's happening. And again, I want to reiterate, the goal they're trying to achieve here is good, getting these people off the streets. The execution of this against this goal, as I don't know how, I mean, again, rock and hard place. They built it at this point. And when we were talking about what topic to talk about this week, one of the lines I used to use, it's kind of like a weapon of mass destruction, right? It doesn't matter if it ever gets used. The fact that it's there means it can.
Right.
And it's just and we've heard horror stories over the years of how close we've come to those kinds of weapons being unleashed. And I mean, there was a false positive in Russia a number of years ago where they thought they were being attacked by the United States. And one guy said, this doesn't make sense. I'm not pushing the button. And if it hadn't been for that, who knows what would have happened? And I'm not trying to be too hyperbolic here, but at the same time, if we'd never, ever built those things, we would have never seen what's possible with them, and how awful they can end up being. But we've built it. And it doesn't matter if Apple reverses course at this point and says, we're not going to deploy this in iOS 15, which I think I don't think any number of what were apparently called screeching voices of the minority will pull them back from that, doing that at this point. However, yeah, the cat's out of the bag. It's possible, and I think that's where other countries, other places, other regions where Apple does business, where the government may not be as I mean, our government has its own challenges, but it's not quite what we see in other countries, where the government doesn't always have the interests of the citizens in mind. Who knows what's going to happen with it?
Well, I'll leave you with one thought, and if you're watching this and you're a security professional or somebody who thinks about security, I would really be interested in your thoughts on this. We've spent the entirety of the discussion talking about the mechanism that's now in play and what Apple's going to do with it. But it struck me just a minute ago, it's not only Apple we have to worry about, because if this scanning engine exists, is that not potential attack surface for people who are not Apple, who are bad to exploit? And that probably to some extent depends on the architecture, and I don't understand it, so I can't say. But
Apple addressed some of this in their FAQ.
Okay, I'll have to read up on that. I'm just thinking
but it all comes back to
point about
the system is architected to prevent. Okay, but every system is architected to prevent being attacked, but that doesn't mean that there's not attack area that they didn't know about.
And every system is exploitable. Like, good attackers will laugh at you when you say, we built it so it can't be compromised. Okay. That's
challenge accepted.
Exactly. So, yeah, I think I've just started thinking about that, but that's another concern here, is what opportunities for exploitation security-wise does this new system open up? Well, thanks everybody for joining us today to chat. If you're thinking about security, I want to mention that later on in the month, August 25th, that's a Wednesday, we're running a megacast called Enhancing Your Public, Private, and Hybrid Cloud Security Posture. It would be great if you join us. I'm not sure we'll be talking about this particular issue, but lots of other pressing security issues. And we've got some great presenters on there to kind of help you level up from a security standpoint. So we'd love to have you join us for that. You can register at events.actualtechmedia.com. Scott, thanks for joining me to chat about this today. I learned a few things, and I appreciate your insights here.
Thanks, everybody.